And welcome to a new edition of the College 12-Pack. I'm your host, Patrick Kahn. As always, Tyler Natuno from LSU Tigers Wire joining us on the show. Tyler, it's been a little bit of a hiatus, but I feel like there's a lot to talk about. Feeling under the weather last week. Good to go this week. But it's actually a good thing that we didn't record because not, 3 hours after we would have finished it, the news broke. Jim Harbaugh is headed to Los Angeles, finally leaving to the NFL. We're not shocked by any of this, are we? I mean, I wasn't. We kind of were all just waiting for it to happen, and it finally did happen.
Yeah, we almost had another example of just massive news breaking like 2 hours after we recorded the podcast. Kind of insane the luck we have with that one. But yeah, I mean, I'm with you. Not really a surprise in any conceivable way. I mean, I think this was kind of the consensus opinion, was that Harbaugh was going to leave probably to the Chargers job, which he ultimately did. And I mean, look, it's a great fit. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, he obviously wanted to make this move. He's flirted with it the last 3 seasons. And, I think he gets a job, where it's a talented roster, a quarterback already in place. The ability to win now, I think, is really appealing to him. And it's understandable why he took that. And I mean, to me, like, the most telling thing from all this was, I can't remember who reported this. I want to say it was either Chris Vanini or Nicole Auerbach from The Athletic, but one of them reported a quote from a Michigan source that I think really just kind of told the whole story, which is, we gave Jim everything we could, everything we were able to offer him, but we can't offer him a Super Bowl ring. And that, I think, is really what this comes down to. I don't think it was about the money. I think it's about Jim Harbaugh wanting to prove he can win it all at the highest level of the sport. And he's going to have a pretty good opportunity to do that, I think.
Yeah, you talk about going with that opportunity in the NFL. And one thing that we all know is, as a new head coach, you're always tied to your first quarterback whenever you become a head coach somewhere. And he got a pretty good one. You talk about Justin Herbert and what we've seen him do, when he can stay healthy, obviously. But, I think that's a good starting point for Harbaugh and the ability to really build around him. I mean, I think LA has a pretty good foundation. They just had the wrong head coach in place. And as we know with Jim Harbaugh, wherever he goes, he finds success.
Yeah, I mean, he's one of the best coaches in the sport. I mean, I think he kind of transcends, along with maybe a guy like Pete Carroll, the stereotype of, college coaches not being able to cut it in the NFL. We know he can. I mean, he took the San Francisco 49ers to a Super Bowl, nearly won one. Had his issues, with, relations with the front office there and stuff. So we'll kind of see how, what he's learned from that, in round 2. It's a very different situation. He's going from, a Michigan program where he was kind of like a god walking around campus. I mean, he was the most quintessential Michigan man there is. They loved him. They defended him, with everything they had. And, now he's going into the league where, you can rub people the wrong way and they don't have those same kinds of loyalties. It hurt him his first go around. He's obviously, I would say, matured since then. Did really impressive things at Michigan. I'm curious what he's learned since that first stint in the NFL, because, I mean, in terms of the on-field product, I mean, he looked like he was as good as anyone.
Yeah, I think so. And you talk about wanting that Super Bowl ring. Maybe he just wants to be able to sit at the table next to his brother on Thanksgiving and be able to talk about his Super Bowl ring. I mean, he has the national championship, which his brother does not have. But as we know, Super Bowls kind of reign supreme. And so not a shock at all. And again, not a shock at all to see who was, replacing Jim Harbaugh. We're talking about Sharon Moore, the offensive line coach, offensive coordinator, getting the promotion up. He did a good job. He was only credited with 2 wins, I believe, as the interim head coach, once in the early season when they were kind of this rotational interim head coach during the first suspension of the season. And then obviously he was the coach, de facto head coach against Ohio State in that win. Now he gets an opportunity to run his program, and we're going to kind of see how he does things. This is going to be similar. I know they wanted to keep that core together, so Sharon Moore made sense. But I am a little bit shocked that it didn't go a little bit longer in terms of maybe looking at some external candidates. But as we know, when you get this late in the coaching carousel cycle, unless you can draw the big fish away, which we know Bruce Feldman had mentioned, Brian Kelly among those names. And that might have perked up LSU ears a little bit, but turned out to be all for naught as they go with Sharon Moore as the new head coach to replace Jim Harbaugh. And I think that's the way Jim Harbaugh probably saw it going.
Yes, just to clarify something, I believe, if I remember correctly, Sharon Moore was the interim for 4 games. I think it was the Bowling Green game earlier in the season, and then the final 3 against Penn State, Maryland, and Ohio State. So he's
You
got, I
might be
believe
right. I
he's,
might be. That is right because they had a second run of
mhm,
suspensions. That's right.
yeah.
It wasn't just
So
the one game.
yeah, so 4-0 as an interim at Michigan,
Mhm.
and obviously has the big one, the win against Ohio State. That's a pretty hard thing to argue against in an interview. He's got on his resume a win over their biggest rival as the Michigan coach. So, I mean, I think it makes a lot of sense in that regard. I mean, obviously, like you kind of hinted at, there were bigger fish they could have gone after if they wanted to. Maybe you go talk to Brian Kelly, see if he wants to come back to the state where he sort of built his entire career. Go talk to Lance Leipold. But I think with those guys, there were no guarantees. I mean, Brian Kelly is making a lot of money at a very good job. I think it would have been an uphill battle to convince him to leave, though I don't think it's like impossible. I mean, there was some smoke that he might have been interested in that job. And then you got a guy in Lance Leipold who has turned down multiple Big Ten jobs, taking extensions to stay at Kansas. I don't think any of those were sure things, and you potentially burn the bridge. You have a pretty good bridge with Sharon Moore. I think it makes a lot of sense. This was an awkward time to make a hire, way late in the cycle. I think sticking with the internal guy, the continuity makes a lot of sense. But with that being said, this is going to be a big task ahead for Sharon Moore. I mean, he's 37, first head coaching job, hasn't been around the sport for too long, only has about like 14 years, I think, coaching experience. So, it's going to be tough. But like I said, he does come in with the win over Ohio State, and that's going to buy him, I think, a lot of goodwill coming in, especially in what could be a bit of a rebuilding year one. I mean, they do lose a lot.
Yeah, they are losing a lot, and to go back to your point about the continuity, especially with the second signing day coming up in just a matter of weeks or days, really. It makes a lot of sense to kind of keep that continuity going because you have a chance of losing certain recruits, but as we know, what is it? They did the numbers. Was it 80%, 90% of your class is signed in the early signing period?
Yeah,
So
something
it's
like
just a
that.
handful, but there are some big guys who do sign late. But that's neither here nor there. I do think it's the smart move. I think with the continuity, and you're right, it is an uphill climb because all he has to do is look to the south and look at what Ohio State's doing and absolutely just loading up. I mean, with former Alabama players, they got Caleb Downs who's coming in, Julian Sand, former 5-star quarterback signee, and I say former. He just signed this last class. He's already leaving. Now he's going to go play at Ohio State eventually. And I think that kind of the transfer portal and seeing this kind of opened the door for some of these players to get out of their NLIs. Like, I'll just enter the transfer portal after I sign and leave, which is what Julian Sand did. I mean, obviously, Quinshon Judkins, who might be one of the biggest acquisitions this team made, not to mention they're going to have Travion Henderson. So they got probably the most talented backfield in the country. So knocking off Ohio State again this upcoming season, it's going to be tough. But Sharon Moore, I think if he can just keep the continuity going, keep that system in place, keep his defensive coordinator, I think they will be good to go for what should be another fantastic battle between Ohio State and Michigan with new head coach. And really this is a going to be a big year for Ryan Day. Because there's been a lot of whispers. I don't know how loud they're getting, but we do know that the faithful there in Columbus are very upset with what's been transpiring over the last 3 years.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. And that's why I brought up how important it is, I think, that he already has that one Ohio State win. Because we'll see how things develop. But I think right now he's probably not going to get it again in year one. I mean, I think Ohio State's going to be a really, really good football team next year. I think they're the winner of the offseason, I would say. I mean, them and maybe Ole Miss are the only two that have made this, similar levels of game-changing moves. I really like a lot of them. Will Howard, great move. Quinshon Judkins, great move. I think this team is going to be stacked, and it's going to be tough for Michigan in year one. But I think, it's gonna ease that sting a little bit if you are not able to win that game next year, because he did manage to do it already, in an interim kind of awkward capacity. So that I think does prove a lot.
And then as we look further to the south, I'm talking all the way south down to Tennessee, we got NIL problems, we got infractions, investigations. We've already kind of seen a little bit of this with Florida State and what happened there with one of the assistants getting a suspension, and now Tennessee's going to have to deal with this, and this ultimately just speaks to the Pandora's box that the NCAA opened and clearly weren't ready for.
Yeah. So, according to ESPN, this investigation from the NCAA mostly centers around NIL, and especially as it pertains to Nico Yamaleva, who is a quarterback signee in the 2023 class, likely going to be their starting quarterback next season. Details pretty unclear at this point. What we kind of do know is that they're looking at possible level 1 and level 2 violations. What we also know is that, potential penalties here could maybe be more severe, because they're looking at Tennessee as a potential repeat violator. They've had multiple investigations run-ins with the NCAA in the last couple of years, most notably the Jeremy Pruitt thing from a couple years back. So could potentially be something to watch there. But I mean, to me, generally, like, this is just more of a trend I think we're going to continue to see. I mean, we're coming up on like two-ish years of NIL being a thing. And I think the NCAA has kind of been sitting there and watching and just kind of gathering evidence on a lot of these teams. They've dropped a few of them. You mentioned the one against Florida State, also Florida. They're looking into the whole Jaden Rashada saga there. Truthfully, we'll see. This could end up being worse for Tennessee than others because of their past violations. But I think ultimately what we're seeing here is the beginning of a much larger trend. I think they're going to drop a lot of these investigations. And will it actually mean anything for these teams? Based on past history, probably not. But I think it is something that, I think is going to probably lead to wider discussions about, more regulation on NIL, because there just isn't really much transparency right now. We don't really know how it works. And I think there's legitimate, Tennessee's defending themselves. They're saying they didn't violate any rules. I think there's a lot of just lack of understanding at all levels about what's allowed and what's not here.
Yeah, and then you look at, you have the attorney generals from Tennessee and the state of Virginia that are filing antitrust lawsuits against the NCAA. So, it's most of this is going to transpire in the court system, and obviously why the NCAA has been hell bent on getting politics involved and having Congress take care of this problem for them, which ultimately I don't know if this is where it's leading, but this is how I feel, Tyler. All roads lead to a separation of power. Is kind of what I feel of this whole situation, because there's no governing. NCAA is a governing body, but they're not governing in a way that I guess that we thought that they would.
Yeah, this is a conversation for another podcast ultimately, but I agree. I think that you're probably going to look at some sort of separation between these schools and the NCAA, at least for football. And I think, I don't know, there's just a lot of issues you're going to have. I think, the professionalization of this sport is one thing, but I think, there's just no oversight. You look at the NFL, there's contracts and there's, a players union and there's collective bargaining agreements. There's all these things. None of that exists at this level. It's all sort of the Wild West here. So yeah, you've got teams that are skirting the rules. The rules themselves aren't quite clear. And also ultimately the only organization enforcing it is one that's proven itself to be pretty toothless historically. So yeah, I don't really see how this is a viable long-term solution, but I'm also not exactly sure what's going to catalyze a major change here,
As we know, the FBS directors run college football, and ultimately it's going to be them who decide to pull away and try something else, whether it's a college football commissioner. I still think the NCAA is going to be within power as far as college basketball is concerned, because they run the entire March Madness and all those things. But when it comes to football, the moneymaker, I would not be surprised if there was a complete separation, and then we have an FBS commissioner. that just seems to be the way that it's going. But let's get back to the actual discussions on the football field. Uh, and out there in Iowa City, there's a new offensive coordinator. As we all know, we all joked about it throughout the season. The Brian Ferentz watch, the march to, well, I don't remember what it was. It was like 350 or
325, I think. Something like that.
325. So it was some wild number for 25 points per game, and that's all well and good, and that's all done. It was announced he wasn't coming back, but now Iowa seems to have found their new offensive coordinator. And pardon me if this doesn't sound exciting that Tim Lester is the new offensive coordinator at Iowa. It feels like a very Iowa hire. Well, let me rephrase that. This feels like a Kirk Ferentz hire.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. Yeah, I mean, that March 325, by the way, that was dead in the water by like September. They were not even close to reaching that milestone. Obviously had a lot of offensive injuries that didn't help.
When you have to average like 40 something points a game just to get to 25 a game for like a remainder of the season, you knew you were dead in the water.
They fell that far behind like after 3 games or something like that. It was ridiculous. So yeah, not even close there. But yeah, I'm with you on the Tim Lester hire. I mean, certainly not anything I'm gonna, be too excited about. I don't think anyone else in the Big Ten is too worried about that. So if you're not aware, Tim Lester is former Western Michigan coach from 2017 to 2022. Got fired last year after 37-32 record. So decent, decently consistent in the MAC, which is hard to do that. But ultimately they made a change. He spends this past season out of football, or out of college football, sorry, and was an analyst with the Packers. He's coming back. I mean, it makes sense in a way. Like, you get a guy, with knowledge of the region, with head coaching experience, but as Ben Stevens, a Big Ten poster on Twitter, pointed out, Lester's last year at Western Michigan, his offense was one of the worst in all of the FBS. And his last year at Syracuse, which was his last offensive coordinator stop in, I think, 2015, was bottom half in the FBS. So not necessarily the most impressive track record here. And also considering he won't have, offensive autonomy, like this is still Kirk Ferentz's team, and they weren't going to do some, wide-reaching philosophical shift overnight with this hire. Like, that just wasn't going to happen. I mean, I'm sure their candidate pool was limited for that reason, and that's probably why they ended up with a guy that neither of us are particularly enthused about. But I mean, truthfully, I don't know if it even mattered who they were going to hire, because I think Kirk's not going to let this thing be much different than it has been.
I mean, there's a certain way they like to play football, and I don't think that they will really want to change it up. Now, mind you, Tim Lester did have some top 40 offenses while he was at Western Michigan. So it's not like this guy is incapable, but I think we both are in the same school of thought here, where a Kirk Ferentz team is going to run the football, is going to focus on being a slow, meticulous offense. They're not an explosive offense. We know that. For one, I don't think they can really get the athletes on that side of the ball to Iowa. They have athletes on the defense who can score, obviously, because we've seen it time and time again. I just don't know if they can get an offense that's explosive, that's down the field. So yeah, this hire is not going to speak well to. It's not going to excite me, for instance, but I think it would be a little bit better if it wasn't under such scrutiny when you talk about Kirk Ferentz and his autonomy. Because if I'm signing on to take over an offense coordinator position with a D1 school, I want to have full control of who my quarterback coach is, who are all my quality control coaches, positional coaches, and I just don't think Tim Lester is going to have that.
Yeah, and the counterpoint to everything we're saying here too is that in spite of being completely anemic offensively, this team is still routinely winning 10 plus games most years. So, maybe who cares? But I will say, the Big Ten West no longer exists. Your path is about to get significantly harder. You can't just waltz into Indianapolis like you used to. You're going to have to be competitive with the Ohio States and the Michigans and the USCs and the Oregons of the world. Iowa's days of sort of, getting in there and being just a lucky upset away from maybe getting to the playoff, that's probably a thing of the past. So that is the concern, I would say, here is, the status quo has changed. changed, so they can try to maintain the status quo as much as they want, but that's not going to be the case in 2024 and beyond. So big questions there. I mean, maybe Cade McNamara coming back, will spark something, but a lot of questions.
Once they get past those first 3 games, it starts to get significantly harder. Yeah, they're going to play Minnesota, but back-to-back games against Ohio State and Washington. Whew, good luck, buddy. That's gonna be a tough one. I mean, they're going to play Wisconsin. They got to play UCLA, Maryland, Nebraska. So not exactly like the worst schedule in the Big Ten, but having to play 2 of the premier teams, right? Back to back weeks. That's tough. I don't care if Washington changed their head coach; they're still talented. We've seen what Jet Fish is doing over there as far as collecting talent, bringing them to Washington, bringing them to the new look Big Ten. All right, let's talk some hoops. We're finally going to talk some hoops. I've been like teasing it for like months. We're finally going to talk about it. I don't know if you know this. Saturday night, big game. Duke, North Carolina in Chapel Hill. There are very few college sports games. I'm talking football, basketball, baseball. Insert sport game here that get me as excited as I'm neutral for the most part. I mean, I do love the Dukies. Don't get me wrong, I love them, but I don't think there's anything better than watching Duke, North Carolina. I mean, there are very few games that I would put ahead of this, regardless of sport, than this matchup that's going to go on.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with that. I think, it's definitely up there. I mean, for sure, I don't think there's anything in college basketball that compares. I mean, it's sort of stands alone in that regard. I think even comparing it, to rivalries and other sports, I mean, to me, I put it right up there. Maybe slightly behind, but I'd put it right up there with the Iron Bowls of the world and the games between Michigan and Ohio State. Like, I think it's in that mix of most heated rivalries. The history's there. Teams are usually pretty good. Both are usually, one of the, among the best teams in the ACC in the country. Yeah, and I think this year specifically is actually a really interesting kind of iteration of the rivalry too, because obviously both teams are in new eras, in early parts of new eras. Hubert Davis coming off a really disappointing year last year for North Carolina. They've looked much sharper to start the year. So I think interesting, kind of improvement on the trajectory there. Whereas Duke, I think John Shire, jury's still very much out. I mean, he's maintained, the sort of machine of it all. We'll see if the tournament success and all that ultimately follows. But I think it's really interesting. I think, 2 programs that, it's kind of unclear where things are trending, once the legendary coaches have moved on. It's, neither of them have really claimed the spot over each other. So I think this year is going to be really interesting.
Yeah, when you talk about rivalries, I'm not going to put either one of us on the spot here, but yeah, I'm with you. Like, it's right up there with the Iron Bowl, the game, Red River Rivalry Weekend. World's largest outdoor cocktail party. I mean, you could talk about all the rivalry games in football. It's definitely right up there for me. I think it's one of the best, and I agree with you. I don't think you can touch that in college basketball today. There's really not. I mean, it's reminiscent. Like, go to the NBA with the Celtics and the Lakers, like those old rivalries. It's right up there with that. I mean, I think it's one of the best. And you're right. You talk about Hubert Davis and John Shire and the abilities that they've been able to do, and they keep the machine going. And up until Tuesday night, it was looking pretty good for North Carolina until that abysmal loss. 1 point, I believe it was a 1 point loss to Georgia Tech. And hats off to the job that the Georgia Tech coach is doing since he's taken over that program, and really that's a resume building win for him. But as far as North Carolina, they have high aspirations, and truth be told, that was not a loss that I saw coming.
No, it really wasn't. I mean, kind of uncharacteristic. They were 9-0 to start ACC play. Obviously on the road, winning on the road in conference play is always tough. But against a Georgia Tech team that, has been feisty, no doubt about it, but, has a losing record on the year. But yeah, huge win for Stoudemire and Georgia Tech. Like, I think there's really a impressive I don't want to go too far down a tangent here, but I think there's a really impressive collection of just young up and coming coaching talent in the country. I mean, you look at like Lamont Paris at South Carolina, the job he's doing this year. I mean, there's just a lot of guys on the rise. I think it's kind of the opposite of college football in that way, where, you're seeing these jobs be dead end jobs in college football. It's quite the contrary. There's a really nice, I think, progression and movement within college basketball.
And not to like throw out my Red Raiders, but despite the
Yeah,
loss last night in Fort Worth to TCU, Graham McCaslin's been doing a fantastic job. I went
absolutely.
into the season thinking this was a rebuilding year, and he's like, "No, we're competing. We're playing for a Big 12 championship in year one." Which is, like you said, in college football, you can kind of view these jobs as it's a dead end job, for people who have high aspirations. But when it comes to college basketball, I mean, I one thing that I've seen in my lifetime that I never thought I would ever see is Texas Tech play for a national championship. So I mean, they can do it in Lubbock, which is kind of nice to see, as opposed to my football team. But we'll see what Joey McGuire can do now that he's got Micah Hudson. And but not to go on a tangent on that. But as we're talking about North Carolina, I kind of wanted to get into a little bit of bracketology talk, and we're not going to dive too deep here. We're not going field to 68 here, but I do want to talk about the top seeds, and Tyler, I think we're in agreement with three, right?
Yep.
We've got UConn, who's defending national champions. They look good in the Big East. Houston, since coming over to the Big 12, is doing exactly what they did, but prior to the Big 12, and that was just absolutely dominating top teams, doing a really good job. Obviously, they had a close overtime win against Texas, a feisty Texas team, but they were able to come out on top. And obviously Purdue, who Matt Painter seems to always have that team raring to go. Just don't let him play Grant McCaslin in the first round. That didn't go out too well for him. But let's talk about that fourth number one seed. We have differing opinions, and I kind of made my opinion prior to last night's game. But I'm going to stick to my guns here, and I'm going to say North Carolina is that fourth number one seed. I mean, the fact that they're 9-1 in ACC play and just the ability to win night in and night out is, like you said, it's tough, especially in a basketball power conference like the ACC, who's been known. I don't know if you agree with me, but I think outside of maybe the Big 12, ACC are probably the top two basketball conferences. SEC is making some headway, I think, in more recent years than maybe prior to that, but really tough. But I just want to stick with North Carolina. Like I said, I'm going to stick to my guns, and we're going to find out a hell of a lot about North Carolina against Duke on Saturday.
Yeah, I would have been with you, obviously, before that Georgia Tech loss. And I mean, I still think there's a fair argument for them to be up there. I mean, they're still 17-4, I believe. We're 9-1 in the ACC. I mean, I agree with your point about the ACC. I think this is maybe a slightly down year for the conference, but, when you look at teams like Virginia is sort of disappointing a little bit. Clemson fell off after their strong start, but still, it's still a deep and talented league. I mean, I think they're definitely still in that mix for a 1 seed and definitely at worst on the 2 seed line. But right now, I think I'd put my fourth number 1 seed. I think I'd go Wisconsin, honestly. I feel like they've had a very quietly incredible season so far. In a Big Ten that I think also is maybe a little bit more down than it's been, but still really deep. They're like 6-1 in Big Ten play. They're 6-3 in Quadrant 1 games, which is really impressive. I mean, to have played 9 Quadrant 1 games already, and win 6 of them. I think North Carolina's 4-3, I believe, in Quadrant 1 games.
Yep.
So yeah. So, I mean, I think, they're coming off, a 15-point win against a Michigan State team that ranks in the top 25 in the net. That's pretty impressive. Big stretch coming up here. I mean, they've got 2 Quadrant 1 games back to back, at Nebraska and then at home against Purdue. Obviously that'll tell us a lot about this team. And I think, between how Wisconsin does in those games, and how North Carolina does against Duke on Saturday, I think I could easily flip these back. By the end of the weekend, I could be back to saying North Carolina back on the 1 seed line. But I think for the time being, I really like what Wisconsin's doing. I'm very curious to see how they close out Big Ten play.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting you bring up the quad one and how you look at Wisconsin, a team with 6-3 in quad one. If you look at the other 3 seeds that we talked about, where you're talking about UConn, Purdue, Houston, all 7-2 in quad one games. So there's not a whole lot of teams that have won 5-6. There's Arizona 5-3, but they're a little bit further down the list. as far as where do you see them at. Kansas again 5-3. Some of the powers up there, but you have to that's impressive when you talk about being 6-3 in quad one. That I think you have a very valid argument there with Wisconsin, a team that really has done well for itself at that 16-4 mark, as you mentioned. Another team that I kind of they're up there, but they're not. I'm not going to say that they're quad or number one worthy was Tennessee. There was another team that I kind of discussed. But looking at their resume, 3-4 in quad one, and I think they're 2-1. No, they're 5-1 in quad two and 3-4 in quad one. So, but I mean,
and coming off a home loss to that South Carolina team. By the way.
So, yeah, they are coming off that loss to the South Carolina team, which is I think, like you said, you talked about the job that head coach is doing there, South Carolina, and obviously that was a huge statement win for them. They've got to build upon that if they really want to be seen as a team that could make some noise. But yeah, it's just kind of interesting when you look at it, and some of the other teams that we mentioned, national powers or really, annual powers haven't really down years. Baylor, Gonzaga. I mean, that Kansas has struggled with 3 losses all on the road. I mean, they haven't lost at home, but they are losing on the road to teams that really they have no business losing. Especially to me, the worst loss they had was at West Virginia, a team that had won. I think they've won 7 games all year.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's kind of interesting, but I'll agree with you now. I did say North Carolina. I will stick to my guns, but I totally can see Wisconsin there among the top 4. But that's going to do it for this edition of the College 12-Pack. We'll be back next week talking more college basketball, college football, and whatever else is going on in the wacky world of college sports. But for Tyler, I'm Patrick. We'll see you next week.